always hoping in you, and I keep my heart set upon your voice, knowing that your word, it never comes back void. No weapon will prosper, no enemy triumph, he will not overcome, he can't scale these walls, injustice will not win, hell's gates will not prevail, not on my time, not on my watch. I am a watchman, and I take my place. As I wait, I will keep the faith. 'Cause I am a watchman, and I stand my ground. But if I never see it, I will stay the course. I will run the race, I will fight the fight, and I will keep the faith. I keep my eyes fixed on you.
Well, welcome everyone. Zach Arscat here from North Carolina on Monday, March the 18th, as we head into spring. I'm going to be joined later by none other than our in-house historian, Randy Grigsby, and we're going to discuss Chris Reed's dream about the rebirth of America. And the reason I'm here and the reason we're having this conversation is because Pastor Tim and the team are in Japan ministering to the gospel. And if you'd like to learn more about our work in Japan, you can go back and watch our Friday series of our noon prayer that Jacob, my brother, talks about as he is in Japan, birthing a relationship with the church there, as we hope to, build upon what has been started there from other ministries, and partner with them in spreading the gospel of the kingdom and helping build relationship with the Japanese church there. Well, today we want to have a conversation, as I said, centered around the Rebirth of America dream that Chris Reed had on March the 9th, that he gave at the service in Morning Star on March the 10th. And he put it out as a transcript, and I'll put the link in the comments below so you can go and read through it. And I'll read through that portion of the dream that we want to focus on. And this is a great example. The conversation that I'm about to play for you guys, we're about to watch, is a great example of what it looks like to go in depth. And this is usually above the norm of what we would really look at when we're interpreting a dream. But because it was so significant in this year, and something that is majorly highlighted to somebody like a Chris Reed, and even ourselves when we heard it, we were really highlighted about it. And something we didn't fully understand was, well, okay, what happened in 1968 that can help us understand the times and seasons that we're in. And so the conversation that I'm about to have with Randy Grigsby is a major in-depth analysis of looking at 1968, some of the events that happened there, and kind of going through. It is not a full interpretation. It's not meant to be that. I'll be very clear about that. It's just meant to be a conversation about, okay, let's gather information, let's understand what's happening and what happened more so at the time, and then seek the Lord through that. And we'll kind of get to that in the outro as well. But if you don't already know who Randy Grigsby is, he's author of 2 books, A Train to Palestine, and his newest one, The Story of Henrietta Zoe, A Labyrinth of Light and Darkness. I'll put the link to those from Amazon in the comments below. I'll also put the transcript from Morningstar about the dream, and then the video that Morningstar has just specifically about that dream that Chris shared on March 10th. So with that, let's go ahead and get into our conversation. And then at the end, be sure to stick around to the end, as we'll kind of give a wrap up and how we can pray moving forward. So blessings, and I hope to see you guys at the end. Zach Arscaden here with Randy Grigsby. I'm in North Carolina. He's in Shreveport, Louisiana, out in the boonies there. trying to get together here with some internet problems we're having here. But today we want to look at, and we're pre-recording this just so everybody knows. We want to look at Chris Reed's dream, where he talked about, he submitted his dream from March the 9th to the body of Christ to kind of look at, where he titled it "The Rebirth of America." And we talked about it last Monday, and we want to go into it a little bit deeper here. And just to give some background, and then we're going to dive into it because Randy has some unique experience, where he lived it, but then also he has a paper that he had written when he was in journalism school in 1968 that he was able to find during research and leading up to this. And what we want to focus on today in our discussion is a lot of the similarities of what we can take from the portion of the dream where Chris talked about in the middle of it, from laying out the eclipse starting in April 2024, where it triggered an awakening, and then that lasted until July 2025 over the election cycle, and possibly in October, surprise and chaos there, because a huge portion of this dream has to deal around when the dream shifted to 1968, where Chris says, I was given an old newspaper which says assassination of two major leaders in the same year of Chicago Convention. Obviously, speaking of Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., where they both were killed tragically in 1968, in June for Bobby Kennedy, and then in April for Martin Luther King Jr. And then the last portion I want to read, and then I want to kind of start the conversation with Randy, is this portion of the dream. Chris says that what's also interesting about 1968 is the Democratic National Convention was in Chicago, and in 2024 it's in Chicago as well. And he said he knew that was significant, but through all the chaos in the streets, in the economy, and on the news, America had a huge awakening and awareness of evil and corruption going on in America, and it was like the vast majority of the nation after this said, we can never let this happen again. We can't. And so there's where I want to bring in Randy and have this conversation about what to possibly do, and how we can look at some similarities of 1968 to now. And before I bring you in, Randy, I want to remind everybody that Chris, his feeling really about this dream was it was a warning dream, and it was something to remind us, one, to make sure that we're listening to God to kind of start a conversation, because it's a 16-month process of the birth of the baby that he talked about from April 2024 to July 2025. And he talked about how he doesn't want to see anything happen. And we would agree with him on this, where somebody's seriously injured. But more importantly is seek the Lord. We want to seek the Lord. And this is kind of what we're doing here with this, is looking through the dream and an interpretation of some similarities here, so that we can understand better and gain more intimacy of why the Lord would be showing Chris 1968. And so, with that, Randy, I want to bring you in and let's start talking about similarities of 1968 to here. And I'll let you lead with this in going through portion of your background and understanding like what you were experiencing as then a college student, leading into possibility like we are now of then Vietnam, and now possibly, the talks of something major happening militarily, also economically, and possibly to the extent of World War III.
To live 1968 and really see the similarities till you sit down and really put them on paper and begin to study. There was a lot of similarities between 1968 and today, 2024. So let me go back and say 1963 actually had something to do. 68 being what in Manchester said it was the year that 1963, John F. Kennedy was president, and the Vietnam War was beginning to gather up. I think we had 10,000 people that we call consultants over there. One was a good friend of mine. And Vietnam had a purpose. We were going to, as a generation, have our good war to fight. to go stop what they call the domino communists in Southeast Asia. There's three things that happened, though, in 1963 that was very pivotal, Zach. The first one was the assassination of the South Vietnamese president, Diem. They didn't have a lot of credibility, but Kennedy had worked with him. But he was assassinated in what we know now was a CIA-backed coup. He was promised his safety, but he was assassinated the day he was kidnapped. And Kennedy didn't take to that very well. But the second point is one that probably a lot of people don't know. And Kennedy had begun discussing with his cabinet and his powers that be in May of 63, the U.S. troops totally out of Vietnam. And he actually, on October the 2nd, 1963, all troops would be out of Vietnam. And of course, he was assassinated. So that opened conspiracy theories for those guys. I think that Kennedy, at some point, though, had to know there was a falsehood or something about Vietnam. Why did he want to pull? Well, Kennedy, I'd read about. Matter of fact, when I was recovering from COVID books on Kennedy, I'd never studied him. He was a man that learned from his mistakes. Bay of Pigs, where we were in helping the rebels, was a complete disaster. He learned from that. The Cuban Missile Crisis came up. The Russians had put missiles in Cuba 90 miles from Miami. He learned how to face down the Russians. So I think he somehow felt something wrong with Vietnam, and I couldn't really find anything on that. But to pull the troops out was a big thing. And for him to be assassinated 51 days later, we know now it's ramped up and became finally a war with 54,000 casualties and 500,000 U.S. troops fighting over there. The one other thing about 1963 before we move on was the Tet Offensive. And this is where I believe, my opinion, and I was a journalism student when I wrote that paper in the 70s, this was the first chink in the armor of the press then, what we call the media now. The Tet Offensive was an offensive by the North. They took over a lot of large cities. They invaded. They were on a roll for a while till Americans and the South Vietnamese got their feet under them back, and they took all the land back, took them all back, and North Vietnamese over 10,000. The Battle of Hue, the biggest battle in the Vietnam War, and it was fought in January of 1968. So Walter Cronkite came on and he said, "We've lost this war." The press back then came up with the option that we're going to lose, when actually we had won, or had come back in the Tet Offensive and actually won it militarily. But at that point, the American people decided we don't have the heart to fight this war anymore. So 1968 was kind of the high point of any American support of the war, even though you still had a lot of people that were patriotic, and we were too, because these were our friends over there fighting. What was lost in the Tet Offensive and in 1968 in Vietnam was the credibility of how America was fighting the war. So I kind of set a foundation. So the similarities in 1968 and 2024. This was a year, like I say, Manchester said, everything went wrong. Well, in 2024, we can't name a lot of things that have gone right either. Things that are striking similarities. Continuation of the war in Vietnam compared to now, the war Israel Hamas. In 1968, the Russians had invaded Czechoslovakia, and the NATO nations had a treaty to defend them, and the Russians went in Czechoslovakia. The similarity today is we have the Russian aggression in the Ukraine. Third point is, so you got continuation of a war, you've got Russians in the world on the world stage, and then the third thing is it was just an impossible task of obtaining peace in the Middle East. Now, in 1968, we were only about 6 months past when the Six-Day War happened, when the Egyptians and the Syrians were going to invade Israel, and Israel caught them by surprise. So that's the same thing today. Of course,
Yeah.
peace in the Middle East isn't every year, but there is a similarity between 1968, 24. Similarities tend to mount if you look inside of it. The protests in 1968 in the presidential campaigns were against the Vietnam War. And it kind of disturbed people in that the middle class felt like they had been left out of this because the middle class was pro-war and the young people, excuse me, the young people had grown and grown more. And of course, you know, Saul Alinsky, who is the American communist activist, he wrote the playbook on what we're living in today, based on the Nazi playbook. And the biggest thing they want to create if they want to get a movement going? It's chaos and disruption in the streets. They had it in 1960 now, and we see anti-Semitism that I don't think you and I could have predicted when this war broke out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of want to take a step back here.
I
I
know
don't know
there
if I
would have been
lost you for a
some, but
second.
not at this scale, not on the universe.
I think okay, there you go. You're back. I want to take a step back and look at since it has a deal. This dream has to deal a lot with the coming election. I have it pulled up the presidential candidates at the time for 1968. You had Nixon, Humphrey, and then George Wallace. Do you remember, just maybe off the top of your head, what Humphrey's I guess stance towards Israel was? And maybe even Bobby Kennedy's.
I don't know for sure, but I think it would be a fair guess then that you would have almost total pro-Israel support in the American Congress scene. I'm guessing that, but
Okay.
the only real break with Humphrey, Zach, and that would be Humphrey was going to probably unravel Vietnam however he had to. Surprising thing is, I'm glad you asked that question because Dr. Lishner just 2 years ago came out with a book, 1968, the year that broke politics, collision, and chaos in the election of 1968. Lyndon Johnson secretly supported Richard Nixon because he thought Nixon would have a better Vietnam policy. And Johnson, for all of his strengths and weaknesses, you know, he got run that second term, but he wanted the Vietnam War to end correctly, which really support Nixon. And Nixon did. You know, he takes a beating later on when I'm in college and I'm a J student. You know, Watergate's there, so everybody wanted to be the president, write that book. Nixon first increased the military presence to stabilize Vietnam. And then he began to get us out in 1975. It was never pretty. It was never going to be pretty. The whole war by that time had blown apart. Politics, 1968 and politics now are not a similarity in my mind on the subjects we're discussing today.
Yeah. I do know that Nixon's policy on the Middle East was to basically fill the vacuum. He said, "You don't leave. You be the allies of Israel's allies, because if you leave it, who's going to come in is at that time Russia, and which ultimately puts Israel and your allies or potential allies at a disadvantage. And so I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, kind of throwing it out there just for the dream's sake of trying to understand the similarities there. And obviously, I think we know where the candidates currently stand of President Trump being strongly for Israel. Biden, he has to be right now. But I think one thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe we can discuss this, is I mentioned it before we got on, is Bobby Kennedy, and this is in the dream, so that's why I want to bring it up. He was assassinated June 5th, 1968, at Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles, California, after winning the California presidential primary by a 24-year-old Palestinian. And I think this is where the similarities with what's going on in the Middle East right now, or Israel more so, and back then, you briefly mentioned it, of the 6 Day War. And I think one thing that's kind of key to touch on, and maybe you can touch on this more, is the Egyptian leader at that time talked about how the reason for cutting off and starting what led to the 6 Day War was for the annihilation of Israel in and of itself. And ultimately, it ended up, part of this war is what changed both Egypt and Syria's understanding and relationship with Israel. And so maybe talk about some of those similarities there between what's going on and what happened in Israel then, and what we're seeing now, and where the Americans' people's hearts were for it or against it at that time.
Nixon was and Henry Kissinger was his Secretary of State. And Golda, they get the idea, and it's true, that Henry Kissinger and Golda were in relationship. They didn't agree. They often were in conflict, but that was the Yom Kippur War that was portrayed. I think the Democrats in 1968 were. I don't see any indication that they wouldn't be. But see, I don't. I think Biden is beginning to show he's beginning to fly his true flag, and that's in two things. America is really pushing for a two-state solution. To happen, it's not going to work if it were to happen, but it's not going to happen because the Arabs have turned down a two-state solution 6 times since 1937 or something. The other thing is, let's don't forget this. Politics in America, we tend to have like a 30-minute memory. President Obama instigated or put in the Iran nuclear deal and a $680 million foreign aid package for Gaza. When President Trump came in 2016, in the first week, he cut both of them out totally. And he did the foreign aid because it was a carte blanche check. There was no check or balances on it. $780 million. A hostile country, if you look at it clearly, somebody needs to answer for where that money's going. I think we all know where the money ends up most of the time. The people live in poverty and so on, so we know. When President Biden came in, first thing he does, he puts the nuclear deal back in, and he puts my question while I'm putting this together is, why is it so important the people on the left have nuclear capabilities? I can't think of the only thing it accomplishes really is to put Israel in more danger than it lives. I don't think that's a similarity between the two, because the 67 war created years before Egypt. First of all, Egypt was soundly defeated, and that was Nasser that was leading the country then. And he fought in the 48 war, and then he was president, and he was of a different mindset in 68 1967. And when he was soundly defeated, I don't think he ever came. The fact that there is a war in Israel and Gaza now is a similarity. Controversial in the Vietnam War, 1960, Hamas Israel war now, and that rise of anti-Semitism. But see, it plays right in. You tend to believe that this creates, on October 7th, it opened up this political landscape. It's a vast landscape of where chaos and corruption and disruption in the streets has continued to grow. You know, it's moved into a world stage of what's happening to America now, in that we've got the problem of the border, which is creating chaos. People are divided. I will say this, you know, people say we've never been this divided, but in some ways we have. In some ways, that's another similarity. I mean, my goodness, we fought a civil war and killed 750,000 of each other, brother and sister. I mean, brother and brother, brother and father. So we have been divided. That doesn't tend to bother me so much.
Yeah. Maybe you could speak to this since during that time you had Martin Luther King be assassinated. Remind us and remind me more so, I think you would have a better understanding of this, is what did that do to race relations at that time? Because obviously we were coming out of the heels of just passing the Civil Rights Act, and now we see this occur. What would that have done at that time? Maybe something to kind of pay attention to for us here in this time, obviously with everything going on from COVID,
Yeah.
of what that did to race relations.
Well, I think of an incident. I think of seeing the riots in Boston, and you know they played this as the South. You know, and of course, most people in the South were not for what was being moved forward. That's why Kennedy was actually in 1963 the editor of the paper in Dallas wrote him a letter and told him now's not a good time to come. There's too much heat on about the civil rights legislation. So it did create a lot of people. But I think about it. I watched the Boston rallies, and you know, I saw a black guy being beaten with the American flag that he was carrying, and that was in Boston, not in the South. There was a lot of violence in the South. The Klan actually used this to spring up again. So it did create a lot of course, after Martin Luther King, there was riots, I think, in like 70 cities across America when he was assassinated. So it did put a different picture on it for us. Amazingly enough, the school I went to, we had us and the black guys had worked together in the summers together. So when we integrated our school, we had no problems whatsoever. But nationwide controversial thing, civil rights movement. Kennedy was not liked in the South.
Now let's flip the page there, and since he brought it up in the dream, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, what would that have done to the presidential run election at that time, with Bobby Kennedy being assassinated as he's running for president? You know, Chris Reed says in the dream that it caused an October surprise, and some turmoil could possibly come up around the election. Maybe looking back to 1968, what would his assassination look like there on the campaign trail, leading up to the 68 election?
Well, first you had George Wallace had softened his stance and had come in as a third party, and he'd actually memory now, but I think he had won something like 5 Democratic primaries. So the Democratic Party as a whole was really concerned about George Wallace, that he would take votes away, and he probably did. The thing that Martin Luther King, the assassin King, took a piece away from the street in his assassination. Protests became violent in many ways because of him being killed and so on. I don't know if that made much difference really in the end. Of course, it was a very close election. It wasn't, it wasn't a complete blowout for Nixon as the second one was. Humphrey was a popular president because he was like everybody's uncle. He was a very nice guy. He always had a way with you. So Humphreys was a good politician. There's no way we can compare the politicians of 1968 to the politics we see now.
Yeah, the electoral vote for that 68 election was 301 Nixon, 191 Humphreys, and then George Wallace had 45. So if not for George Wallace, you'd be sitting there close. They'd have to have a runoff or something, most likely. I don't know the rules on that, but that sits there pretty close. I mean, obviously those states, it was Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia who all went for George Wallace, and so those electoral votes,
Yeah.
that would have decided who would have happened and what would have happened, and who knows? Maybe now. I mean, I know there's talk of possibly Kennedy now being a third party or somebody else. The reality of what that actually takes, I think, now takes away. You have to be determined. I mean, there's very few states that actually have independence. Arizona, West Virginia, off the top of my head, but most other states, it's hard line, right, left, Republican, Democrat. So, um, just processing this dream out here. So, I think we see some things there that are quite interesting. And is there anything you want to add to that before we move on?
Well, there's similarities, but we've also laid out the huge differences, because without the Vietnam War, 1968 probably would not have been the year that it ended up being. Vietnam War was the pivotal point of politics, and there would not have been a Vietnam War if he had not been assassinated. So now you've actually got three. I'm not Chris's prophecy. There's reasons why he got the number 2. But if you plug in John Kennedy's assassination, along with and Dr. King, now you've got, that's what this chaos on the streets. And that's what people who want to change things, that's the instrument they use. Majority of the South was pro-war. The majority of the South was still not for the civil rights legislation. But you're going back, you can't go back and judge people in the time they lived. It's like Winston Churchill was a colonialist. He was for the British Empire, lasting forever. And of course, we know that was not for the best, but you can't go back and judge people in the time that they lived. I don't think the civil rights movement was signed and everything. I think if you go back, you won't see a lot of, we accepted things when they happened. When they happened, we accepted things. The Vietnam War is what split people apart. It's a big riff. It's kind of like you were almost afraid to talk about politics or where your stance was on the war.
Would you say that the 6 Day War had any effect on that as well, or was it all just at that time the American focus was on the Vietnam War?
It could very well have. I've outlined a book on Vietnam. I'll never write it, but I just wanted to outline it and understand it. The Vietnam, Robert McNamara in the White House. Now, if we had D-Day like that, we'd probably have to take France. You don't run a war in Southeast Asia White House. You turn it over to the military. That's what made, I'm writing this book on the Second World War. I've grown to admire Franklin's. My daddy was just totally upset with that comment because he didn't like his economic policies. But he turned wars over to military people and winning it. Let's do this. And Vietnam was not that way. It was a disaster when it started. My opinion.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah.
And the way that people were
Now you
treated.
said,
I'm sure you've seen that, the way soldiers were treated when they came back from the war.
yeah, yeah, that plays out huge. Actually, like, and in everything in history that we see that I grew up with. Let's go back to your paper. When we had talked before recording, you had laid out some things that I think would be beneficial because it leads up to and kind of coincides with the dream of seeing when you talk about your paper of leading up to what we can do to look forward to for the future, as far as like, okay, we're seeing some similarities, we know the history there. You talked about how like 68, 69, the drug war, um things started to heat up there. You want to speak to that, and then we can get into kind of what we can look forward to, and more so why it would be important for us as we see these similarities that the Lord's showing us in this dream. And I think what you're talking about with John F. Kennedy in '63. I think that does tie in because you're right. It does lead up to creating the cultural and political environment of '68 that I think kind of highlights of how barriers were removed and then chaos was able to ensue, which we've seen that with COVID and et cetera stuff, which has allowed chaos to ensue here in our time. Um, but I guess go back to the 68, 69, and kind of what was the cultural change there from, as you know, people were starting to stand up and push back against Vietnam. Since you were talking about you were living it, you were growing at that time. Like, what was the mindset of that change from, before 68 going into 68, 69 for the American people? That maybe that's more of what we could, I guess, look at and pray for and pray against that shift there.
Yes. Well, there was our generation in 1968 was very frustrated with the war. Like I mentioned, it was almost like we wanted a good war, and then when we weren't going to have our good war because we saw uncles and brothers and fathers come back and just defeat the evil of Nazism and the imperial Japanese military. We lost that, and it created a vacuum. It created a vacuum that we filled with uh, complete foolishness. That's when the drug scene started. Uh, that's when there was a split between the youth and middle class America during that time, Zach. There was a breakaway that middle America stayed pro war, stayed very conservative, and the youth of I was 17 years old, 18 years old then, and we just totally were frustrated with the whole situation, and we parted even with among family and so on. I felt a different father about that time because I never openly spoke out against the war because I had friends there and I had people I knew from our town that died over there. So I never openly spoke against it. There was a lot of frustration. I think that has moved into now. I think the frustration that we felt as young people back then, we see in many ways, we see it and we're frustrated in that our generation, we've not really done anything to help solve this right now. The American people, I've said this before, we're very unique people. We love to stand on the sidelines. We love to be appeasing, and we love to look at things from a distance. 2 months before Pearl Harbor, 80% of the American people said, "This isn't our fight." The day after Pearl Harbor, they could not open up enough recruiting stations. The
Yep.
same thing would happen today. I believe it. But the thing I like, especially moving into his prophecy, the thing that really gave me hope on this, but then there's frustration now, actually from the same generation, I think, our generation, the baby boomers, I think they call us. But when the Ashbury revival in 2023, I never look at my phone at night. I put my phone away and I read a book or something. But one night I just got my phone and opened up Facebook, and there was the revival live. And it was in Kentucky. right? Wilmore, Kentucky. That really struck something in me because that was the night that they got the older people to stand up and they surrounded them and prayed for
Yeah.
that generation to stand up. And see, that's my generation. And since 1968, we've really given the mountains away. We've talked about the 7 mountains. We've talked about losing education, the colleges. That's on us. That's on our generation. We haven't done anything. So when I saw that, that's the first matter of fact, when you and Pastor Tim were talking about his prophecy, Chris, that's the first thing I thought about was that revival. Because out of that revival, other revivals begin to move, if you remember, especially in
Yeah.
football teams for some reason really started breaking out. Auburn is in Texas. And the LSU team had a revival from the Daniels guy that transferred over. I think Ashbury was um, a big thing. I'll bring this up too. We could have won the war in Vietnam. My friend that I tell you was one of the first 10,000 over there. 3 trips he went, 3 tours. The last tour he came home, he told us, you'll get killed and we're not going to win it. We're not going to be allowed to win that war. And that's a man that was over there fighting it. That same frustration is a thread that goes across from 1963 to 68 to today. For me, the fact that in 2020, our vote and our voice was nullified totally. That's just added frustration in that we haven't done anything about that. Does that make sense? I mean, where I'm going with this, to me, there's a thread that runs across those generations.
That does. Yeah. And I don't know if you watched if you watched Chris Reed's, and I'll put a link in the description below for when we play this, is his sermon portion after he gives that dream is Micah 7, where he talks about that, how, son will be against father, father will be against son, mother against daughter, etc., stuff like that. And so he laid a good groundwork and said, look, this is where he feels like Chris, I'm speaking about, feels like this is where the body of Christ is. And then if you take a step back, and before COVID or during COVID, what was Rick Joyner's his one contingent word that he kept harping back on was 2 Chronicles 7:14, return the hearts of the fathers back to the sons. And that's where that's the dichotomy of what we're the spread economics terms, investing term there, that we have to decide which world are we going to live in, which mind frame are we going to live in. Are we going to live in one where we have divided households, or are we going to come together and in forgiving and laying aside offenses that may very well have legitimate concerns or effects that need to be dealt with, but at the same time is like we still have to learn to love. Love has no remembrance of wrong. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. But ultimately, is like he quotes it here. He says Micah 7:7. He says, "This is the answer," and Micah gives a solution. Is therefore I will look to the Lord. I will wait for God, for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. And
Yes.
so, anything you want to add to that? Because to answer your question of do I see the similarities? Yes, and I think scripturally as well. Chris does a good job of outlining that in Micah 7. If you haven't watched that portion of that sermon, I would highly recommend going back there, because once you see it, it also, to me, it also speaks of the Laodicean church and the Laodicean age that we've been prophesied to be in as well.
For us to get, there has to be a huge repentance on the part on America. We have to repent. I don't think my opinion. This is not necessarily the opinions of this station. I don't think God's happy with us at all. Way in my mind, Zach, every morning when I pray for America and Israel, that He wants these 2 great countries to fail. But sometimes God wants men to solve the problem. I understand that God is in everything, but I love the book of Joshua. And when the dedicated thing was stolen, Achan, I think, stole it. And God told him, don't take anything that's mine. And he took it. And Israel lost the battle. And God went into the tent, or right, he said he went in to see Joshua. And Joshua was on his face weeping. He knew something was wrong. And God said, stand up. What are you doing on your face? Stand up. In other words, that's the, if you interpret that into North Louisiana slang, it was like stand up and be a man. You know something's wrong, straighten this out. And somehow I feel like sometimes that's where we are with God. We've made this, there's a solution out there. And I love to talk to you in just a moment. We tend to make it very complex. But on this day, the 15th day of March, this is a simple solution to save this country. I honestly believe that we are months away from losing this country if we don't get it right. I think there's a link between Israel and America today, and I think that the very thing that's going to destroy us started in 1968. So that's why his dream was important to me. There was a movement that started there because you'd never seen it other than in the late 20s, early 30s. There was some socialism that rose up in America. But except for that, Zach, we've never seen a breaking apart of generations and a country being split politically. We've been there before. But there are things going on in the political realm that goes beyond the pale of politics. The way that President Trump's been treated is just appalling to me. Of course, people are outraged about it. But let's remember Ted Netanyahu's autobiography. Netanyahu, the same thing was done to Netanyahu. He was allegations and money and everything. The thing most people don't know is none of that was found to be true. Media doesn't cover the rest of the story. They want to create that image between these two men. I believe these two men are who we watch and see what happens. I don't see anyone else coming on the stage to replace a Trump or a Netanyahu. Where would Israel be right now if they had kept their liberal leader? Would he have bowed to what the Biden administration? You know, from a military standpoint, the worst thing you can do is do a ceasefire when you now understand ceasefires to get civilians out of the way. And Israel has done a wonderful job of. I just saw where they went in and did an operation and got 60 orphans out of Gaza and got them over to Bethlehem in safety and where they can have food and medicine and so on. Israelis, they love life. That's why when an Arab revolts or does something in Israel, he's taken to Hadassah Hospital and given military treatment. Israelis love life, and I think we're joined at the hip in these days, Israel and America.
Yeah, and I think that right now we're seeing that. To me, again, going back to, I know the timelines of the year with the Yom Kippur War and what happened October 7th line up, but to me, with this dream and the 6 Day War in 67 that started, and then here we are, 68, it had an election, 2023, 2024, the year before. Some similarities cried out, and the fact that Israel or Egypt wanted to wipe Israel, like that was the stated goal of that, was to wipe it out. That's where they were. Obviously, we see no real effect, but even now, Gaza and Hamas wants to, more so Hamas, wants to be being the proxies of Iran to wipe out Israel as they continue to say that statement around the world. And one thing we can end on this is the end of it. He talks about, he in his dream he saw the baby wrapped in American
Yes, yeah,
flag. To me, that's the most important thing, because okay, now we understand the environment that, like, for me as a parent with young kids, is I see the environment now that my kids are going to grow up in spiritually. And now it's like, I think for us spiritually, the spiritual baby that we're seeing is we're going to have to, with both old and young generations, um, nurture this baby and help guide this baby through what difficulties may be and give them the foundation so that they can handle the things beforehand. And so I close with this, is kind of leaving it with you, is what would be some advice, say, for somebody in my generation, to seeing some similarities between then 68 and now, that you would say, hey, here's some, if I were in your shoes, what would I do? Like, if you were in my shoes, what would you do, knowing what you know now?
Well, I have a little sign on my desk I keep with me all the time, especially when I wrote Henrietta's book and now the Second World War. Somerset, it's a great question, and I'm going to answer it with this. Somerset Maugham saw 1930s England almost give their country away, and he was a British writer. He said, if a nation values anything more than their freedom, it will lose its freedom. And the irony of it is, the things that they value more, being comfort or money or so on, it will lose it also. I honestly don't see that generation, this young generation that we see in our church, these young people. I don't see that. I see where they've got this figured out, that they've watched, maybe not to a full degree. You know, you live life when you're young, but I think they're very conscious of where we are today and how we got here by not reacting and not really putting a wall up against the people that want to totally presidential election. This is, they want to take our country and change it forever into a place that you and I won't be comfortable with. Your children, my grandchildren, my great grandson, my great grandson. To me, that baby, when I think about that prophecy and I think about that baby, I do think, and he's wrapped in America, I think it's a new America. That baby wrapped in that flag, to me, represents a new America that's about to step forward and take control of this. We can't lose. Think about how dark the world would be without an America or an Israel. And I think we're like I say, we're tied at the hip on this conflict, and we only have a few months to do something about it. But I think that baby is a new America being born. That's the good thing. That's the good news. I think there is answer. I think there is going to be a new day out there when we look back and say to this young generation, well done. What Ashbury was about, that was that young group of people. What were they? They were very young people, full revival, and they understood exactly what was going on.
That's good. That's good. All right, we'll end there. Before we close out, remind everybody where they can find your books and any resources, anything that you put out. What's the best way to find your books?
Amazon. Joe Rosenbaum, and well, you can get it on Barnes and Noble, but most people go Amazon. I have some books locally. I would love to talk to schools. Yeah, what would Henrietta Zoll do if she saw the anti-Semitism now? So I always thought Henrietta's book was timely for today, because it goes into a lot of the politics and how she changed by watching the riots and so on.
That's good. Is there any last comments you want to say before I end the recording?
In the last, I've been deeply worried about our country and about Israel. But in the last 5-6 months, when was the revival in Kentucky? Let me see.
I think April of last year.
Yeah, that night did something for me. I've always started moving forward since the revival. I think things are, and of course we know the election, and I mean this is fairly simple too. But I think Biden will stay in and run in 24. I don't know why, but I think he will. And we know who he's going to oppose. It's all set. Everything's set. It's simple. Here we are. And in America, you make a decision.
All right, I want to wrap up real quick. our conversation that I had with Randy. As you can see, 1968 was a very contentious time as the events that took place in the dream Chris warns us about. But most importantly is we have to harness this war spiritually that we're going through this year so it doesn't turn into something perverted as you saw in 1969 with Woodstock. Now ultimately God can redeem that as we see through the 70s, but ultimately is if we can prevent that, hopefully we can. So let's guard our hearts. Let's pray that this nation's heart is guarded, and pray into the hope that this stream shows us that there is a rebirth for America, but it's also something that we have to steward as a remnant in the body of Christ, moving forward, and pray and intercede and be a watchman on the wall for that baby in an essence. So with that, I'll wrap it. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment wherever you guys are watching from. That really helps us out. And don't forget, you can find Randy's books on Amazon. First one, A Train to Palestine, and then the second one, The Labyrinth of Darkness to Light, the story of Henrietta Zoe. Great historical books that you can read there. Go support him. And we'll be back this week with our regular schedule. And we thank you guys for watching all the way through. Blessings, and we'll see you guys later. Have a good one.